Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you to 2n1 Ministries. We are very thrilled that you have chosen to join us today. We would love to hear back from you as well, any comments that you might have. And Todd is going to be sharing one of those with you today. A verse that God has often brought to my mind is a verse from Proverbs, and we can learn a lot of wisdom from the book of Proverbs. And this verse is found in chapter 16, verse 8. And it says, "By mercy and truth iniquity is purged." Iniquity is sin. "And by the fear of the Lord men depart from evil." So as we teach our class and continue on our theme of the death of a nation, we wonder, how can I apply this to myself? What can I learn from this? Well, first of all, we'll define two of the words in this verse. The first word is mercy. What is mercy? Mercy is forgiveness. And forgiveness can only be found in Jesus Christ. Starting with understanding salvation. Jesus came to set us free. Jesus says in the book of John, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And so then you ask, well, what is a definition of the word truth? Good question. Truth is being in accord with the facts of reality. It's the opposite of falsehood. Jesus said about himself in John 14, verse 6, "And Jesus said unto Nathanael, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me." So, how can we apply all of this to what we're going to be talking about today? And we're going to be talking about some exciting things. But the theme of our lesson today is, if we fail to learn from history, we will repeat those same mistakes. For example, my grandfather, and his name was August Lining, was kidnapped or confiscated, you might say, by the Russian army. And instead of being bitter about that, every time I see a Russian person out in public, I don't have to be that way, because when I have understood the mercy of God, how He forgave me when I got saved, then I have the ability to extend that same forgiveness and grace to other people. Today we are reflecting on, every day as we turn on the news, how our Bill of Rights is being eroded. And in the first part of the Bill of Rights, it discusses how we have the freedom of religion, we have the freedom of speech, we have the freedom of the press, we have the freedom of assembly, and we have the freedom of petition. So, Todd is going to continue on teaching us what we can learn from the history of things that happened back in the 1960s in the United States of America, and how we can keep from having those same freedoms eroded today, and what we can do about being bold in our day and time. So thanks again for joining us, and again, we want to remember that we can always learn from the mistakes of people in the past, so that we can be changed, and so that we can be successful and we can be prosperous in our society, and in the greatest country of all, of course, in the United States of America.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Heather, and thank you for joining us back again. I think we're being shadow banned by YouTube, so if you want to share our video with your friends, that'll help get it out, because I don't think we're showing up too much on the searches anymore. I think the leftist media and big tech is not liking our study, which we're doing. And what I wanted to do is bring out the point that the communists' favorite tool is to use racism as the means to be able to gin up and have people sign up for their cause, which they're not putting out. We're communists. We need people to help us. What they're doing is saying we need social justice, and we need to have the people of color to be justified. And so what we're going to do is hold a rally, have a talk, and explain what's been happening so badly over these past 100 years. And they did this back in as early as the 40s. There's a man named Manning Johnson who wrote a book in 1958. We'll get into that some other time, but he was in that movement and came out, and the purpose for it was that he was going to hope that things would get better from what he was being told. You know, you're a black person, you've been sold a bill of goods, you've been, unfairly brought here from Africa, and you're natives and all like that, your forefathers. And so he bought into the idea that the communists were their friends. And so he went ahead and followed the suit, did the same thing back in the 40s and going into the 50s, rioting and looting and doing all the things that we saw later on in the 60s still going on. He got out of it and got wise and wrote a book about it. And if you want to get a copy of that excerpt, you go to wayoflife.org and look up, Google search that, DuckDuckGo it, or whatever you want to do it, and put in wayoflife.org, Manning Johnson, and pretty eye-opener. But what I want to do is talk about, the trap or the lure that the communists are using even today, is why we're going through this book, Death of a Nation, is because we're not learning from history. As Manning Johnson figured out, and then these, in the 60s, they went through the same thing, continuing the lie of believing the lie of the communists, is on the topic of racism. So the term race, as we talked about before, is not in the Bible, except where it says, run the race that's set before you. That's a good thing, a good race. But the term race is actually brought about by Darwin, who disbelieved God, tried to prove that there was no creation, but there was evolution. So if you think about the evolution of the species, then you, if you're a particular skin color, I don't want to use skin color because that has nothing to do with development, but if you go by that, then they will say, well, the ones that are of the lighter skin persuasion are more advanced evolutionary, from an evolutionary speaking terms, than, say, the people with dark skin, which there's no common sense to that. Everything started in the Fertile Crescent, which is like in the Middle East, Iran area, what's today Iran, and so forth. So if you look at it from that standpoint, that's closer to the equator, so you're going to be having darker pigmentations there, and then obviously people as they migrated northward and southward into the southern hemisphere, then you'd have lighter skin, which then that would denote a later development of evolution, if you thought that. So anyway, it's all just a bunch of things that they use to have there be their rallying cry. But we had a person asked a question here last week, and so I sent them a reply, and I'll read it to you. And the question was asked, can you explain to me about the races? So I said, I suppose that by you asking this question, what's the difference in races, you mean what is the difference in people's outer appearance? Basically is what the topic's about, with these people purporting racism. But I said Darwin referred to races, quote unquote, to denote the species' advancements through evolutionary development. But from a biblical viewpoint, we know that there was only Noah's family, 8 in total, including himself, who presumably looked like a modern day Persian or someone similar of the Middle Eastern people. After Noah, his 3 sons and their wives, 1 each, began to repopulate the earth. The Bible says that there were people who followed Nimrod. Nimrod didn't believe in God. nor the people who followed Nimrod. They wanted to find their own way to get to heaven. So they devised the plan, and they began building the Tower of Babel. So God saw that the people were in the process of corrupting themselves as those did before the Great Flood. So God confounded their languages because up to that point they all knew and spoke one language. After their languages were made diverse, the Bible says that they left off building of the Tower of Babel. This was the start of the division of people groups, who then began to pair off into tribes after their own familiar language. During this time in Genesis, we're told that the, quote, earth was divided. I find that in Genesis 10:25. Now this, quote, dividing of the earth, unquote, could mean that the continents were separated. You look at the continent of Africa, coastline, and continent of Central America, South America, and it looks like they're kind of like wedged together. So maybe it's dividing of the earth that way. Could mean that the continents became separated, perhaps splitting apart from each other. Or maybe the, quote, earth was divided meant the effects of the sun on people's skin color, which further divided the earth population of people. Separating them even more. Unfortunately, Satan and his cohorts have used these wedges to supports to pit one people group against another unto this day. Hopefully this sheds some light and understanding on the topic that has lost people, unsaved people, so angry these days. But most of their lack of understanding is the fact that they have been brought up under evolutionary teachings. Yet God created Adam and Eve, who were the original parents, after which came Noah, as mentioned, a few generations later, out of whom all the human races, out of all whom the humans we now see came from. So we all trace back to one blood. And so that's my reply, which is a biblical reply. You trace back to one set of parents, that they grew the population of the earth, that it became wicked, like it's doing now. So God came in, saw that Noah was righteous, and his 3 sons, and each of their wives, and so it was 8 people. Everybody knows the story, most of y'all. And it's a worldwide documentary that's known and discussed in all the religions. That's what they call the teleological argument. That, whether it's in Chinese literature or Egyptian literature or something like that, it tells about the early gods were angry at the people of the earth. Of course, they put it in their own vernacular because they began worshiping other gods, so they put it in their own little storyline. But ultimately, in all the religions of the world, you had the story of Adam and Eve, and that they angered God, or in their terminology, gods, and they came down and separated them out of the garden. And then later on, Noah came along. God saw them and found grace to keep the population of the world going through them, and just destroyed the rest of the earth. So basically, after everybody else in the whole world was destroyed at the flood, you had Noah and his wife, and basically 4 couples that repopulated all of us. And so they were all the same lineage. So we just have color differences. We all trace back to that one blood. So this racism business is nothing more than a diabolical plan from Satan, and is being used by him through the communists to produce all this what we have now: Antifa, Black Lives Matters, black man good, white man bad, and all this stuff. And it's all a bunch of lies. We're all brothers and sisters.
Let me back up real quickly to the Tower of Babel, in case you're not familiar with that. People were trying to build a tower to heaven because they thought that they could get to heaven by their own good works and by their own efforts. But Jesus tells us all through the Bible, in every book of the Bible, that we cannot be saved except for the sinless blood sacrifice that Jesus had promised in the Old Testament, and he fulfilled in the New Testament now approximately 2,000 years ago, that we are not saved by our good works, like it says in Ephesians 2:8 and 9. but we're saved by our faith in Jesus' blood sacrifice. So I wanted to clarify that that's why that was the time when God did divide the earth, and the different skin colors came out and the genetics at that point.
Yeah, because the whole earth at one time was like one perfect environment. Maybe it was a little cooler up in the northern region. Like you had woolly mammoths that could be found embedded in blocks of ice, the icebergs, and it melts down over the course of time, and these woolly mammoths in ice. And then you have obviously large animals back then. If you had extreme temperatures and it killed off lifespan and so forth like that, as we have now, catastrophes and so forth. But so people lived longer, animals lived longer, and probably migration wasn't quite as what it was. And so as people began to migrate, like I said, you're further away from the equator after the flood, then the greater chance that you have of your skin's not going to be quite as darkened by the sun. So anyway, I thought I'd have to run that by you to give you a little clarity on the quote-unquote race issue that we have nowadays. It's just a tool of Satan. But we see that this tool was being used back in the 1960s, even as far back as 1925. The Communist Party set up this agenda to do. So this guy, going back up to the 1960s, Stokely Carmichael was a big ringleader of pushing communism in this country, and he had gone down in 1967 to be learning and giving speeches in kind of like a little rally speech down in Cuba. We discussed that last week, and then he took back his doctrine that he was talking up and learning and embracing even more communistic viewpoints, and came to Detroit and began to unsettle the blacks in that area, crying out that they had civil rights violations and so forth. And so we go down to, it said, an organized group that he had done, largely outside of the Detroit area, had been operating in the city more than a month. This group had assignment to burn and destroy the city. And then Lomax, who was reporting on this, said, well, he was the militant civil rights activist. He said the group was highly organized and well trained, not thieves and arsonists in the ordinary sense of the words. So here's a man who was a civil rights activist who admittedly said that they are well trained and not just your common thieves. But then, as we'll get into it in a few minutes, the FBI, and there was hearings and so forth like that, saying, why do we have all these riots? And after so many months of studies, like 7 months of studying this out, this communist sympathizer who was brought on by Johnson, President Johnson, disclosed that there was no evidence of foul play. But here, the Louise Lomax said that they were indeed trained revolutionaries. So he also said the revolutionaries committed to the conclusion that the power structure does not have the moral fiber to repent for its socio-economic sins. Now that's him looking at it from his communist viewpoint, that having socio-economic sins would be, if you're an entrepreneur and you want to hire people and pay them a wage that you agree to and he agrees to, but maybe if it was a union, that they would say, well, you need to pay them more. So stuff like that, where you enter into an agreement, but because you have outside agitators who say things like, well, you're taking advantage of people. Jesus gave that example of the one man who went out to hire people to work in his field. So he hired somebody at the beginning of the morning. Says, work for me today and I'll pay you a penny at the end of the day. And he says, okay, and he went to work. So then he needed some more workers, and about noon he went out found some other people standing around idly, you know, wanting to work, but nobody hired him. He says, come work for me today and I'll pay you a penny. And I said, okay. So then finally, towards the end of the day, let's say the day was at 5 o'clock and it was shutdown time. Well, he hired somebody at 4 o'clock. And then he says, you want to work? And then the guy says, yeah. And he said, okay, come work for me and I'll pay you a penny. So at the end of the day, when it was time to, you know, clock out and get paid, the first guy was called forward, and he said, okay, here's your pay, here's a penny. And then the next guy, no, that's right, the last guy that was working for the 1 hour, he was told, come up and I'll pay him. So he paid him a penny. So then the next guy in reverse, the 12 o'clock guys came, and they got paid a penny. So then the guy that worked the longest part of the day, from 8 o'clock until 5, he thought, well, I'm going to get paid more because I worked longer, and then he got paid a penny. So then he complained about it, you know, and said, well, I should have got paid more, and he said, well, you agreed to it. So anyway, stuff like that, you you get people rationalizing that what they think is right and wrong and like that, and then calling it a socioeconomic sin, like this guy, who was a communist, said that only truly corrective measures is to leave the nation in ashes. Okay, because you don't agree with the minimum wage. Okay, we're going to go out and riot and burn down buildings and create murder and mayhem in the streets, and leave it in ashes. And then, of course, after that, we can all get, you know, a greater pay raise, and we can get recognition, and somebody pat us on the back for being Asian or Indian or black or whatever it is. Doing that is just destroying our own country, our own livelihood, our own children's lives, you know, that they can grow up in a normal, already preset, ready-made community to go into. But if you leave it in ashes, then they're going to have to start from scratch and work themselves even harder. So it makes no sense. But of course, none of the communist ideas make sense. Otherwise, Soviet Union would be flourishing today, and we'd be a pile of heap on our own demise because we just didn't know any better. You know, we thought we knew it all.
Quick comment here. I had a small opportunity this week to watch what a couple of the speakers were saying at the CPAC meeting in Orlando, Florida. And one of the speakers was Ben Carson, who is a well-renowned, great Christian black surgeon. In fact, some of his studies and success have been with surgeries concerning conjoined twins. But anyway, he said a little comment that ties in with what Todd is speaking about, that even though slavery was a reality in this country many years ago, that's something that he's not bitter about. And he said you have to get over it, and you have to be able to move forward and look for, you know, a brighter day and a vision in the future. And a lot of the things he said resonated with me, ministered to me, and I do encourage you to participate by looking those speakers up from the CPAC meeting this week, and you can connect with that on Right Side Broadcasting.
Yeah, and if it was all as bad as these people, like these communists back then, said, then surely it would have been corrected 54 years ago to now. But they're continuing to agitate to try to wear down our government that we have now, and the Constitution, and replace it by the doctrines of Marxism. So Lomax continued to say the principal U.S. cities have been chosen as initial battleground simply because they afford us the kind of cooperation by innocent and uninformed people that every such revolution needs. So he's admitting that we chose these particular cities like Detroit and Newark and Chicago, all these places, because they afford us the ability to have uninformed and innocent-minded people. Oh, they'll believe what we tell them. Oh, they think that we're going to help them, like Manning Johnson was saying. And so they get on board, and then they become pawns So, for the revolutionary needs. And so, how is it that this wasn't considered an assault and an insurrection against our country, even though there was hearings on it? So, in his series of 5 articles, Lomax explains how the revolutionary agitators, posing as magazine salesmen, went through Negro neighborhoods and spread throughout Detroit their lies about how bad you're being treated and all this stuff. And they laid the foundation of hate. Then they waited for an incident to occur between the Negroes and the police, which then was the spark to start the riot. Now, was that in 2020 or in 1997 or 2004? Well, yeah, it happened in all those years too, but this goes all the way back to the 1960s, 1967. So then he said, methodically breaking store windows, and the revolutionaries urged the milling Negro people to loot and steal. Hey, go on in, get you some shoes, get you the this and that. But, and at least a dozen observers confirmed this, professionals did no looting of their own. In other words, the Carmichael, people like Stokely Carmichael, he didn't go in and break windows and steal stuff. His goal was to create chaos, and out of the ashes of chaos would be able to rise communism. So that was their booty, not the shoes and clothes that they can get out of Christie's or whoever it is that they're breaking into. So they didn't act as thieves. They were men at war, this Lomax says. They were men at war, revolutionaries bent on reducing the nation to ashes. The looters unknowingly cooperated by having a happy time. The streets teemed with whites and coloreds who stole with abandon and glee. People came in with cars from miles away and hauled away off freezers, sofas, televisions, and clothing, unquote. That was in 1967. That's what we saw last spring and summer in 2020. So it's the same game plan, the same denial by the media, same denial by the Democrats. President Johnson, keep in mind, he was a Democrat. And then when this study was done about how the riot started, they found no evidence that there was any kind of collusion. There was no evidence of conspiracy. How is that? Because you got insiders in the Democrat Party back then, even more so now, with the Bernie Sanders and the Bidens and Harris and all these others, that they are bent on having insiders working within the government and outside of the government to create the atmosphere to eliminate this union as we have it now. So why didn't the police stop the looting? Dr. James Boyce, a Negro professor at Wayne University, asked the police that question, and they were answering him and said, the police chiefs told us to stand down. We were following orders. So, if you're a law enforcement officer, you enforce the law. See somebody breaking in, looting, rioting, like that, you arrest them. If they're being militants, then you send in the military to quell the militants. You don't let them continue going on and on like we're doing nowadays. So, with that, we'll finish up. We'll get into next week why we had such widespread blindness then and how we're having it now as well. So thanks for watching. Hit subscribe.